Pardesi Beats. What's up, everybody? You're watching Pardesi Beats Unplugged, or you may also be listening to us online. Today with us, we have a very, very special guest. Amarjeet Sohi is here, and we're going to have a little bit of a struggle referring to him as Amarjeet when we've grown up calling him Uncle G, knowing him from the community. So some of us might say Amarjeet, some of us might say Uncle G. So that's sort of how we're going to go in this process. And with me, as always, we have Dadwal, Malik, and Kushi. Simran's not here today, but he's still in the loop into what we're asking questions to Amarjeet today. So Amarjeet, the main reason that I reached out to you and we wanted to have this conversation was last week was Canada Day, and sort of just in my journey through life and being Canadian, I found a lot of similarities being Punjabi, being from a community that was a part of the British Empire when India was, and then also being Canadian, which was once a British colony as well. And this is in regards to the Indigenous communities. And what's been happening in the last little while is there's been a lot of burial sites found in the old residential school locations. And that sparked a lot of, I guess you can say, spotlight again on the residential school process and systems and the victims. And that sort of got me thinking that, hey, when we came from India, being whether it's my dad or you or anybody who came as an immigrant, did we know about this? Did we know about the Indigenous communities or did we not? And that's sort of the general thought process. So my sort of question to you is, how was it for you before you came to Canada? Because I know you have some insight now, and we'll get to that. But how was it for you? Did you know anything about the Indigenous communities, or how was that?
First of all, thank you guys for having me. I've been in Canada for 40 years now, and this Canada Day, I would say, was the most reflective Canada Day in light of the discovery of unmarked graves of children from Indigenous communities who were taken away from their families, put into these horrible, horrible residential schools, and beaten up, abused, sexually abused, and killed. Nobody knew where they were buried. And so it's just a dark, dark history of Canada's history, right? That a lot of people did not know about. And coming back to your question, Patwant, right? When I came here, before coming here, I had no clue whatsoever about the rich history and the presence of Indigenous cultures in Canada. And before Canada was settled, nobody told us about the history of Indigenous peoples. Nobody told us how rich those cultures were and how vibrant those economies were before the settlement. And the story that we were told of Canada was of the settlement, that this is a land of immigrants where immigrants go and prosper and build their lives, but nothing was taught to us or conveyed to us through any process about the rich history of Indigenous communities on this land.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you came here then, so obviously there was nothing before that, which is interesting because that's sort of the premise, is that nobody knows. This was a hidden, secretive sort of process that's coming to light more so these days. And so a lot of people are discovering things, right? So then when you first came to Canada, I mean, it's been 40 years. And when you first came, not sort of now, but right when you first arrived, and you started discovering, this is an Indigenous person, or these are Indigenous people. And what were your first impressions, in sense of how are they portrayed to you, sort of?
Yeah, that's a very important question that I have been reflecting on quite a bit over my time in public office, and before that as a community activist. When I came here, you learned about Canadian culture and Canadian way of life by interacting with other people or through the popular media, through the news stories about what do you watch on the television, or what is portrayed to you through books and through storytelling. And in all those incidents, Indigenous peoples were always portrayed in the negative light. They were always portrayed as a burden on the society. They were always portrayed as people who don't work, people who are, addicted to drugs and alcohol, and people who are a burden on a society. And that make a lot of people biased toward Indigenous peoples. It's not that you are born biased, that you are deliberately biased, but that is what society is teaching you. That is what society is telling you about people that you have never interacted with. And that is the experience of a lot of immigrants coming to Canada, that they're never told the true story and true history of Indigenous peoples and how Indigenous peoples were colonized. Like, I knew more because I grew up in India, about the colonization of India and how British people, took over parts of India, and from that they built their base and continue to colonize the rest of the country. But no one ever told us to make that connection of history of India's colonization and the history of colonization of Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples in Canada. Okay? But what you were told was completely reverse, right? That these people don't know what they're doing. They are just lazy people, which is absolutely crap. That is not the case. But that's what you were fed. That's what a lot of immigrants, even today, are fed, that misinformation, which leads to a lot of bias and discriminatory attitudes to our Indigenous community. So you coming back to your question, we were not told anything before we came here. And even when we came here, we were told a different story, which was completely not the right story and not the proper story. So my engagement with Indigenous communities actually began when I started my advocacy on anti-racism work, when I started my relationship in the community, because I faced a lot of racism and discrimination when I got here. Like, I was young and I was in school and I couldn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture, but I looked different. Looking different meant that you were a target of bullying, target of racism and discrimination.
Yeah.
And I was looking for allies. I was looking for people that I could relate to, that I could work with to change things. So I joined couple of organizations in the early 80s here in Canada to mobilize against racism and discrimination. And actually, that is the time that I came into contact with some Indigenous community members who were fighting for the same things that I wanted to fight for, which is equality, which is fairness, which is justice, and anti-racism, right? And that's how I came to know of the history of Indigenous peoples in this land.
Okay. That's very, very accurate, because so you've experienced that, and we have a little bit of obviously age difference between us, and we come from different generations, you can say. I'm going to add a little bit of my experience in here so you can add to it as well. But growing up in Edmonton, I was born and raised in Edmonton. Obviously, visible minority growing up in the 80s. I wore a patika as a kid, a turban. And I experienced those exact same things you just referenced. I experienced racism, being left out, made fun of, being questioned. And I didn't mind the questioning because people want to learn, right? But the tone of that questioning wasn't always positive. It was always sort of derogatory. And in those situations in elementary school, I often found myself as a student sort of being away from the rest of the students, but I always found Indigenous friends because they were also in that situation. And it's very interesting that you say that. So I want to just give one more story to sort of, I guess, add to your experience, and then we'll talk a little bit about now and your journey after that and what you've learned. So one of the biggest things that I remember, and Kushi, I don't know if you were here at that time, we were at the hospital. My Tayaji was in the hospital a while ago, and we were in the waiting room, and there was this indigenous patient, and he was obviously, for some reason that I don't know because I can't assume, he was being monitored by another sort of medical aid of some sort. And that medical aid, or whatever his profession was, the person was from India. He was an immigrant. He was from like middle or South India, because I talked to him and I know this. But what he was saying to that indigenous person literally were these words. He's like, well, you guys get free money anyways, and you guys just waste your money. You don't have to pay tax. Yeah. He was saying these things to him in the waiting room. And knowing what I know, and I had lived in Wabasca, Alberta, which is Treaty 8 territory. I lived on the Big Stone Cree Nation Reserve for a year. So I have firsthand experience with the community there. And I couldn't keep my mouth shut to this guy. And I had to tell him, I was like, you don't know the truth. And I said, these communities faced everything that we all should know by now. And the guy was stunned. He was like, I had no idea. Nobody ever told us this. And the patient was just quiet. And at the end, like, he was a rowdy patient, but at the end, he just said, thank you. And he left. Yeah. And that really made me think, like, nobody knows.
Glad that you stood up.
The standing up,
I'm glad that
you not, but like, the thing is, standing up aside, the thing is that just showed me that nobody that came from outside of Canada, well, not nobody, but a lot of people, I guess, don't know the truth about the Indigenous community.
Even as like a 90s kid for myself, like growing up at school, as Uncle G was saying, like his experiences of, like, you know, society kind of like boxing in Indigenous folks and kind of labeling them as this or that. Like, I had the same experiences growing up. It's like, you know, you would be told like, oh, maybe you don't talk to those folks or whatever, right? They're just going to cause you trouble. So you can, I mean, I knew at a very early age, it was like, okay, like, these guys are getting picked on for whatever reason it is. Like, obviously my brain wouldn't understand it at that young of an age, but now you can see the whole picture. But for me, it's like, it's been they were treated pretty unfairly in terms of like the society's eyes, right? Or the lens.
Yeah.
But so, that's how racism works. That's how racism works, is that you are told a single story about people, right? And that single story is not always the right story. And it's not always the story that needs to be told.
Yeah.
The single story that has been told about Indigenous peoples is exactly what we've been talking about, that they don't work hard, that they think too much about their birth society, which is not the right story. No. And you can relate to that story being told about us, right? About, like, I'm not a turban Sikh, you are, right? And like, what is the perception of the Sikh community in the 80s in India and here? Because you were basically told a single story about the whole community, right? And so my journey of understanding of Indigenous cultures and Indigenous peoples actually started with that exploration of how do I interact with the community to make my life better and deal with racism and discrimination that I was facing. I think when we try to relate our own experiences with other people's experiences, then you build allies, you build friendships, and then your understanding broadens. And part of that process for me was to unlearn all the bad things I learned about Indigenous communities, right? Yeah. And that unlearning process took quite a while. But that process was helped by those people that I was interacting with. And that work also allowed me the opportunity not only to work with Indigenous communities, but also allowed me to work with the other cultural communities from, particularly from Latin American background, right? Then again, connecting to Latin American Indigenous communities and their struggles for survival, and against their struggles against colonization and dictatorships in Latin America. So I think that really broadened my understanding.
Very, very good points there. And, so 40 years later, and through the processes of those 40 years, do you think, from your perspective, do you think the Indigenous communities, I guess, their perspectives, or their perceptions is the right word. Has that changed outside of Canada from, if you know this, or maybe you've spoken to people that might know this? Do you think that narrative has changed, or information has been brought up about them?
I think the discovery of unmarked graves of indigenous kids made international news.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in different countries read those news, and they really never thought of Canada in that light. Right?
Yeah.
Now they're thinking about Canada in that light.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're learning about that history of Canada, where indigenous communities were marginalized, they were colonized, their culture was taken away from them, their kids were taken away from them.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can ever imagine. Like, school is the most safest place that you think your parents send you to, right? And in this case, these kids were in a school or schools that were the most abusive places. Right? So just imagine, just kind of trying to grapple with that reality. I think those images on the news, seen around the world, are raising that awareness about the dark chapters of Canadian history. Another thing that I'm noting, which I find very positive, right? These are horrible things that are being discovered. But the flip side is that a lot of immigrant or new Canadians or racialized Canadians who did not know about the history are also kind of shocked, right? Because they also had this different image of Canada. They also had this different image of indigenous community. Now they're seeing these things on the news, and they're completely shocked because they never imagined that this would have existed in Canada. So I think that's the flip side of reflection and conversation and realization that what had happened to indigenous communities and the repercussions of those being felt today. If more indigenous people are if more indigenous people are homeless today, that is directly related to residential schools, right? That's directly related to indigenous marginalization. If more indigenous people are dying of opiate crisis, right, overdoses, that directly ties into that history of marginalization and
it's like
colonization.
a negative domino effect.
If indigenous people are overrepresented, trauma is intergenerational. And you can relate that to, like, when I think about these unmarked graveyards being discovered and families not been able to put closure because they never get to say goodbye to their loved ones, right? Because they never knew where they were buried.
Yeah.
And at a different scale, you can relate that back to what happens in Punjab in 80s, in early 90s, when hundreds of young people were snatched away from their families and killed in false encounters or taken away from their families and never to be found, right? And still their whereabouts is not known, right? So you try to relate to those experiences in a way and make it relevant for people.
I think that's a very great point. And that's why personally I started relating to the indigenous peoples through that avenue initially. So I think a lot of Punjabis who see that parallel will understand that whether you want to call it the Canadian government or once upon a time the British government who was colonizing different territories, I think the sort of intent may be similar wherever they were, perhaps. And we see this with the Australian indigenous communities as well. So I guess, that brings me sort of to now where you are currently in terms of your journey. You've served in the city of Edmonton here before. You've served in the federal government. You've worked with different companies and organizations in which you've gotten experience with the indigenous communities in multiple ways. And what is your insight through that process now? Like, what have you learned? What insight do you have? any positive sort of messages you want to give, or something you want to say to our community so they can sort of, fix that gap?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that I can share from my experience and my interactions with Indigenous communities, and they go back a few decades. When I got elected to City Council, at that time, we signed Indigenous Urban Accord, City of Edmonton's Accord with urban Indigenous communities of Edmonton, talking about that relationship, talking about that cultural exchanges that allow people to know each other better. And then my work as a member of parliament and federal minister, particularly the work that I did as natural resources minister working on Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project, where I had a chance to personally visit close to 60 to 70 Indigenous communities throughout Alberta and British Columbia.
Wow.
So here are a few things that a lot of people don't understand. First of all, Indigenous communities are not one homogenous group, right?
Exactly.
They're very diverse, right? And they're different nations. They're different languages. They're different cultures. They're different traditions. They're different cultural sites that are completely different from one nation to the other. So I think a lot of people lump all Indigenous communities into one, right?
Yeah.
It's like saying, all people from India are same, right?
Exactly.
That's not the case, right? India is such a diverse country from cultural, linguistic, and geography and every point of view. And so are Indigenous communities here in Canada. So that's one thing, right? The second is that Indigenous communities are very, very resilient communities. What they have gone through and still survived and still are working hard to thrive and revive culture and history and language is phenomenal. That resiliency you don't find in many, many other communities, right? So that's another, the resiliency. The second thing, the third thing that I think we need to understand as people who have come here from somewhere else. Now we have built our lives here. We're integral to the Canadian society now. Canada is our home, and this is our country. Is the realization that Canada existed before 1867.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of people, when we talk about Canada Day celebration, right? We are actually celebrating the Confederation of Canada, the coming together of different provinces.
Yeah.
And Canada as coming together as a nation.
Yeah.
But that is not the only start. That's not just, you go back before that. People lived here for centuries. Indigenous communities lived here for decades and decades and centuries before that. And they had very thriving economies. They had very thriving cultures, right? And they were, successful people, right? So that's the third point that I try to make when I am speaking on these issues. The fourth is, again, going back to our earlier conversation, trying to relate our own experiences with the experience of Indigenous peoples and trying to build alliance, trying to build allyship for a shared goal of building inclusive communities where we all feel that we belong. And the fifth point is that we need to recognize, if we want to really reconcile the differences and move forward together, then we need to recognize the truth. Truth is that Indigenous communities have been deliberately, the genocide has taken place on this land when it comes to Indigenous communities. And they were deliberately tried to be eliminated from this land. Their cultures were deliberately tried to be eliminated.
And some were eliminated.
That truth has to be recognized.
Yeah.
If that truth, once we recognize that truth, then we can find better ways of reconciling and working toward the challenges that are faced by Indigenous communities.
Well, that's, the third point, Amarjeet, you brought up was, I think it's very important, because when I grew up, I went to school in the 80s and 90s, right? Obviously a little bit past that, but those years are crucial, the early childhood education. And I didn't hear anything about Indigenous, anything to do with Canada. Now I know that different years you learn about Indigenous communities, like grade 7, the curriculum in grade 7 and 10 are very, very telling of Canada's history before Confederation. And in that, you do learn about a lot of the different Indigenous communities and different societies and then how they formed. You learn about Hudson's Bay Company ruling territories, Rupert's Land, all that 13 colonies that turned into United States. And you get some insight, but obviously the truth isn't fully there. And my sort of what I'm trying to go to here, my question or my, I guess, talking point would be the change in our education system from when, people like us here in the Pardesi Beats growing up to now, seeing that there's a lot of Indigenous education given in our schools. Obviously, this is Alberta focused, us being in Alberta, but when I grew up, there was nothing, nothing I remember at least. And then now I see it all over the place, which I'm very happy to see. But like, can we talk on that a little bit? Because that was your third point.
I'm going to jump in on that, especially growing up. I know me and Kushi are kind of the same age, so we grew up in the kind of the same school curriculum. But with that, it was a very romanticized version of Canada, of the settlers came in and they did this and they did that. But it didn't give the space to learn about the Indigenous cultures. Like Amarjeet was talking about, every one of their cultures is different. They all represent a different identity. Yeah. And a lot of that was kind of brushed over and kind of given a general picture. And the idea of the settlers came from France, they came from England, they started the fur trade, things like that were very romanticized, whereas that may not have necessarily been the case. And the way that history is told in schools, or was at that time, was very different than what the actual truth was.
Yeah. No, and that's so true, Malik. Right? When you look at Edmonton, for example, Edmonton was a meeting ground of Indigenous peoples, right? And this is where the early settlers came into contact with Indigenous communities. The Fort Edmonton site and the current Rossdale plant around behind the legislature ground, that is where Edmonton and Edmontonians of that time lived. They were not called Edmontonians. They might have been called different name, right? So but do we ever imagine when we talk about Edmonton in that sense? No, we don't, right? Because we have never been taught about that. We have never been told about the rich history of Indigenous peoples on this land. And that has to start with the school system. Yes, we are doing better now, but we are still not doing as better as we need to be, right? Why are Canadians shocked about residential schools, right?
Yeah.
Even now, this is 2021, we are still shocked about residential schools when Indigenous communities knew about the existence of unmarked graves.
Yeah. And, I've seen firsthand some residential schools or remnants of them. And just looking at that and imagining, being Indigenous or a child who potentially was abducted or has no knowledge of who they are, their identity, that identity cleanse, and then that identity struggle once and if they make it out of that school system, which displaces them from their own culture and from mainstream society, if that's the right way to call it. So these are very, very good things. I think, Kushi, you had a question that you wanted to ask, which ties this in.
Yeah, because I like to tie everything into personally what I can do, right? And then so when I think about my journey and then even your journey, Uncle G, right? So what I'm kind of trying to pinpoint and maybe get your reflections or opinions on is that, how can we, being people of color, being children of immigrants, you yourself, being a father, we have a new father here, Patawant. So what can we do? What is our role? Since because my experience is this wasn't a thing for me. I didn't have Indigenous knowledge at all. It was all kind of in the back, and it came later in life when that inspiration for social justice and that came more prominent for me, right? Then that learning came, but how do we bridge that gap? What's our responsibility, or what can you maybe recommend based on those 5 points you just made, which are really good? How can we kind of do our part to help bridge this gap and become allies for Indigenous folks?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways we can do that. One is, trying to make make friends from indigenous communities, right? Try to go visit the places where they gather, or invite them to our places of worship or gatherings that where we come together, right? So I think that's one. The second, I think there's a bigger role for religious organizations to play, educating their congregants. Invite a speaker from indigenous background who can tell our congregants, spend half an hour, 15 minutes telling them, making a presentation about the rich history of indigenous communities and trying to relate that to the colonization of India and colonization of Canada. And there are a lot of organizations that are doing anti-racism work, right? So when we face racism, when we are working within our own organizations, why would we not expand our network and work with other organizations who are doing the same work, right? And try to build that allyship. And another thing that we can do is actually study the 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? And they are pretty, revealing in a way that you learn so much about the history, but also there are practical things that we can do. And one of the recommendations that came out of those 94 recommendations was to actually revise the citizenship guide to include more about indigenous peoples and indigenous culture. So when we become, like, for example, when I became Canadian in 94, right, there wasn't much about indigenous history in the guide, right? I don't know how much there is now, but you can absolutely include more, that when immigrants become Canadian citizens, then they learn more about that. Exactly. Teach that in schools, right? Teach that in our other cultural and religious institutions. So there's a lot of things that we can do, little steps and bigger steps.
Yeah. So, with that education side of it and teaching, Malik, you're experiencing something where you're learning a lot about these things.
Yeah. So, and I think that kind of touches on to Kushi's point as well. Now, kind of, we're out of school, we're in the real world. So we can't change our education that we've kind of gone through. But like Amarjeet was talking about, it's reaching out to those community groups and developing those bridges. But also there's going out of your way and finding places and courses that you can learn. There's a free course that's run by the U of A right now called Indigenous Canada. It's a wonderful course. I'm taking it right now. It teaches it. I'm only a few weeks in, but I've learned so much about the different cultures, the different backgrounds, and it's a wonderful starting point for even anybody that really doesn't have an idea of how to start or where to start about the Indigenous culture. But it's through the U of A and it's free. It's called Indigenous Canada. It's a wonderful course, but it's starting to take action for everything that has happened.
Absolutely. I took that course during the pandemic. And you can do that on your own pace at your own time, right? It's such a beautifully designed course and engaging course to learn about Indigenous. So I would second Malik that take that course.
Yeah, and especially if you're Punjabi, you'll realize that the Indigenous culture is not too different than the Punjabi culture. Like the religion out of it, culturally they're very similar.
Yes.
So. Having said that, Kushi, did you have any more questions, or Malik, do you have any other questions before I sort of, change the little avenue a little bit?
No, I think I'm good.
You think you're good, eh? Malik, you had a few.
Sir.
No, you can continue on the avenue you're going down.
Okay, so the avenue I'm going down is more so, Amarjeet, you mentioned that people in our community, and when I say our community, I'm speaking into personally Punjabi community, but born here in Canada. So that's specific to me. But you were saying that we should go and visit perhaps Indigenous communities or invite them over to whatever we're doing, whether it's through the religious side or the cultural side. And I wanted to just say that I spent time with the Indigenous community. I spent a solid year with them in Treaty 8, mind you, not Treaty 6 where we're located now. But in doing so, growing up in Canada, learning about Indigenous communities here, studying from A to Z a textbook called Our Canada, published by Nelson, which is probably the most transparent history of the Indigenous communities that I've read, and there's probably better out there, but that's what I've read. I actually learned so much just spending time with them. I learned a lot of their traditions. I lived off the land with them in very small increments. And these are just general life skills that can help you. And I found it so beautiful. And when I was watching a lot of the ceremonies or partaking in some or just observing, I was just like, this is me growing up going to Punjabi events. This is literally no different other than the language. There's drumming involved. There's dancing involved. There's a lot of singing involved, which I didn't understand. But if you might imagine yourself not being Punjabi, listening to Punjabi singing, you might feel it's very similar. The drumming, the dancing. So in terms of, Amarjeet, in terms of our culture being Punjabi, have you noticed any similarities with the Indigenous communities here when you've gone to any of their cultural happenings wherever they might be?
Absolutely. I think one similarity that I found quite relevant is when I was growing up in a small village, you would have elders come together and tell oral stories about the history of Punjabi culture, or they'll tell oral stories about gurus and the wars and everything else. And that oral storytelling tradition is so strong in Indigenous communities as well, right? So that's one that I would say, right, that I find quite relevant in that culture connection, right? I think there's a lot of bias in Punjabi community against Indigenous communities, not the fault of the community, but because of the culture that we are taught, right, through popular media and through what we watch and what we see and what we read. I think we gotta start, challenging our own assumptions and our own bias toward Indigenous communities and trying to learn more about them. And then try to question what is happening now, not blame them, but has more empathy and more compassion, and try to understand that if Indigenous communities are struggling today, there are reasons for that. Those reasons are historic, and those reasons are historical trauma and marginalization that they have experienced.
And I think that's a wonderful point of connecting with them in whatever way we can. If it's changing the perspective of people around us, there's a lot of resources online as well. If you look up toolkits for reconciliation, if you don't really know where to start, there's a lot of good resources. Just a quick Google search away, like Patwant was saying, volunteering or in getting involved with the community. That's another great way to get involved. But I think it's important that we start challenging ourselves. That's a big thing. As a Punjabi community, we have our biases, and it's okay to challenge those biases.
One beautiful thing about our elders, right? Like your parents and even your grandparents, is that, like, if I'm talking to my cohort, my age group, right? If I'm talking to your dad, for example, Malik, right? He may not listen to me as much as he would listen to you, right? And your grandparents. And, I think the point I'm making is that young people, if you engage with your parents and grandparents on Indigenous issues, right, you will make more impact in changing their perceptions and their biases, right? So I think one thing that you can do as young people, actually have a discussion among your group, among your friends, and say, maybe we need to take a leadership role in teaching our own community about Indigenous communities.
That's a really good point, Uncle G, because I've, personally speaking from my own household, sometimes I've had to challenge the narrative that's been there, because I think a lot of the time we think that once you hit a certain age, your learning is done and your growth is done, but that's not really the case. We're kind of always evolving at whatever age we are. So I do second that point as well.
And that's sort of the premise of this episode too. It was to kind of bring this knowledge and discussion to our viewers and listeners. And so having said that, a couple of things we'll still finish up with. But first of all, Amarjeet and Uncle G, because I can't not call you Uncle G. Really honestly, thank you for your insight. It means a lot to hear that from you. Somebody who's served in different sort of spectrums of work and experienced these things firsthand, as well as immigrated here with the lack of knowledge of Indigenous communities and then gained it and evolved it in your personal life. So we'll probably wrap up here. So again, thank you for joining us today on Pardesi Beats Unplugged. And if anybody has any comments or anything, you can put them in the comments below. If you're watching on YouTube, you guys can subscribe and share. But more importantly, I do want to do a little plug for Amarjeet here. Amarjeet is running for the mayor of Edmonton. We thought that was going to happen before you joined the federal government, but never too late. And I think it's a great time. So without getting into the political discussion, but the whole Pardesi Beats team definitely wants to wish you the best of luck in that venture.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
And we do want to ask for the listeners and viewers who are interested, where can they find out more about that?
Yeah, so anyone can visit our website, sohi.ca.
Okay.
All the information about the campaign is there. Election is on October 18th, so we are about 3.5 months away from it. Please get involved. Get involved in any campaign and inform yourself and engage with your community and engage through that campaign with Indigenous communities and ask candidates what the plans are to tackle systemic racism and what the commitment is to reconciliation with Indigenous communities and what they're going to do if they get elected.
Very, very good point to ask.
Yeah.
So once again, thank you for joining us today on Pardesi Beats.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
We appreciate you stopping by to join us. It was a really insightful conversation.
We're going to get you on more.
Nice to see you guys. Nice to see you guys.
It's good to see you.
Haven't seen you for a while. I think you have grown in 15 months. You have grown so much.
That's what happens in the pandemic when you're all caved up. Everyone just has
in different ways,
I guess. Yeah.
So before we go, Malik, do you want to let the viewers and listeners know about our social media, and then we'll end the show?
Yeah, for sure. So as Patwan said, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. We are on all major platforms for podcasts, so make sure you download. You can listen to us on the go. Message us on Instagram, Twitter at Pardesi_Beats. Also, we'll leave some links down in the video description for Indigenous Canada, the course that we were talking about, and some other ways to get involved. Like we talked about, the biggest step is the first step in challenging yourself. So thank you, Uncle, for joining us today.
Yeah.
Cool.